All right, so I will talk to you today about finances. So you might wonder, I'm here for living well and mental health. Why talk about finances, right? But there is actually a lot of evidence showing that financial concerns about finances, so people being worried about money, people being in financially insecure situations, that is strongly linked to both physical and mental well-being. So it might even affect things like cognition and memory. So there is research showing that people who are in financially precarious situations not only feel worse, but they also have trouble making long-term memories and so on. And it is a concern that is increasing. So you've probably experienced, all of us experienced the cost of living increase since the pandemic, right? And the number of people who say they're stressed about their finances has been increasing in the past years. And in the last Stress in America survey by the American Psychological Association, so just early this year, they found that 72% of people who were surveyed said they were stressed about their finances in the last month. So people do worry about money and they feel stressed about money. One of the aspects about why they're stressed and what they're worrying about when they're worrying is, of course, a lack of income or perhaps cost of living and so on. Another aspect that they're worried about is that they feel they're falling short of their own spending goals, right? You might have desires and plans for the future, how much you want to save for retirement or for the next vacation or all those things. And people feel like, oh, I overspent, I bought those shoes I didn't need or that iPad and things. And people feel like, oh, they're falling short of their own intentions and desires. And that is the aspect of financial stress that I'm looking at and that I want to tell you about today. So some of the situations, just to kind of clarify again, what do I mean by this falling short of goals? When we interviewed our participants and we asked, like, tell us a situation where you felt worried about money, where you felt you acted poorly, where you felt you wished you had acted differently. People mentioned things like, oh, I got too many drinks and exceeded my entertainment budget and things like that. I went out and it was just so tasty that I spent 3 times as much as I wanted. Or they mentioned things like, I went to Best Buy and just wanted to buy a cable and I came out with an iPad that I didn't really need, you know, and now I don't have the money for this other thing I wanted to buy. Or even just listing things like grocery spending and overspending at the checkout relative to what they were planning to do. Now, today I want to tell you, just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about, is I'm going to talk first a little bit about what is financial self-control, because at the bottom of all those examples lies the lack or the falling short on the financial self-control. So people said, oh, I wish I had had more self-control. I wish I had not given in to the temptation and followed my goals instead. So I'm going to talk about definition. What is financial self-control? How do we think about it? I'm going to talk about some strategies people can use. What did we find in reviews of literature and interviewing people? What are some strategies people use that makes it more likely that they stick to their goals? And then I'm going to review a number of studies. So there's going to be some data, but it's going to be all super easy to understand. It's just basically dollar amounts, which you all are familiar with. I'm going to review some studies where we looked at what strategies were most effective for our participants when they were trying to use different strategies throughout the month, and then seeing how that affected the actual spending throughout the month. All right. So what is self-control? For the longest time, psychologists thought of self-control as synonymous with willpower, or the idea that you suppress a tempting impulse. So you might be familiar even with this metaphor of having willpower as a muscle. So the idea that, oh, you get stronger at willpower and then you're better at suppressing the temptation. You see that laptop or iPad that you shouldn't be buying and you just suppress the temptation. And if you're really good at that, then you're going to not give in to temptations as much. Now, more recently, psychologists have come to think of self-control as a bit broader. And here the idea is that people can arrange their life in ways that make goal-directed decisions easier and giving into temptations less likely. So you can also think of this as a kind of arranging your life in a choice architecture that makes some choices more or less likely. So to give you an example, here's a situation with a temptation of buying the iPad. If you think of it on a timeline, there might be things that happen way before you even get into that situation. So you might be setting goals, right, for yourself. You might be sitting down with a partner or by yourself, making goals for the month. And that might influence whether or not you're going to make a goal-directed or a temptation-oriented decision in the moment. You might be setting a budget before you leave your house that morning, right? You might be forming intentions about which stores you're going to go to and which not. If you know you're like really tempted by computer stuff, maybe don't go to Best Buy and instead buy that online where you perhaps are less exposed to some of those tempting advertisements. Or there might be things in the situation when you're already seeing the tempting object that can affect which choices you make. So for example, some thoughts like thinking of the future plans you have, thinking of the future self, thinking about how you might regret this decision when the next iPad comes out in 2 months and it's better, So there is a lot of strategies or tricks you can play on yourself, if you will, right? Like just don't go there if I know I'll be tempted. All those things you can do beyond just suppressing the temptation in the moment. All right. So I want to tell you today about lots of strategies so that you have like a repertoire, and you probably already have lots of such strategies yourself, but I'm going to tell you about lots more. Okay. So first of all, we were interested when we started this project just looking at, well, what strategies do people use to improve their finances? We were interested, what do researchers think? So not just researchers in psychology, but also an economist and anyone studying judgment decision making, basically. And we did a meta-analysis of studies that were published that used experimental designs in which people's strategy effectiveness was tested. So where they really compared like people were instructed to do this one thing or a different thing, and we find a significant difference between those two, suggesting that is an effective strategy. And what we found, so we started with, we had like 1,500 articles where we reviewed the abstracts, but we ended up with about 48 studies that really used an experimental design comparing two groups in terms of strategy effectiveness. And what we found was the most common things that they found that was really effective strategy was make specific goals about spending. So people setting specific goals about how much they want to spend or how much they want to save, that led to them spending less and saving more than people making general goals or no goals at all. Limiting access to money was very effective in these lab studies. So people using cash actually limited their spending because they didn't have access to all that wealth that was in their bank accounts. So they couldn't spend more than the cash they already had in hand, and that lent to them spending less. There's also a lot of research on denomination. So if you have bigger bills, you actually tend to spend less because you don't want to break them than if you're paying in smaller denomination bills. But this is all kind of connected to this accessibility of money, a form of money. Making budgets, so itemized lists of things you want to buy before grocery shopping, for example, has been shown in several studies to be quite effective in limiting spending. Thinking about the future self, there's a whole range of studies there too, that if people, because arguably your temptation will benefit you now, but the saving will benefit your future self later, right? So thinking of the future self highlights the benefits to that future self, and asking people to think of the future self helps them. There's even studies showing that if you take a picture of participants and you Photoshop it to look older, and then show them that picture again, they will save more money for retirement than if you don't do that or show them just a regular photo. And imagining the regret you'll feel. So instructing people really think about how you'll regret this purchase. Perhaps not surprisingly, it reduces the number of people who want to make that purchase. So there is a lot of strategies here. These were the 5 most common ones, and they're all tested in the lab and have been shown to be effective. However, these are usually the outcomes here are just tested for the effectiveness for one decision, right? Like in the lab or immediate decisions. Now, beyond academics, there's also, of course, a lot of other strategies that are out there in in the idea world of like how do people, what kind of strategies do people hear about, what kind of strategies do people think about. We also turned to the media to look at, well, what kind of strategies might people read about when they read websites or magazines and things like that. And here we looked at Google. So we just took the English Google from .com, google.com, right? You get different results depending on the ending. So we used that, and we used the first, we looked at 180 websites that all talked about advice and strategies for financial matters. And we coded the suggestions people had. So on those 180 websites, two coders found that there were 1,950 suggestions. Of these, about half were actual strategies, the way we define them. And the other half that we found was just things like get a better paying job, move to a city with lower income, all those things are not strategies the way we define them, right? Because you can't really do that very easily. It's not a cognitive strategy. Okay. But of those strategies, what did we find? The most common ones was the just don't go there advice. So the restrict access, avoid places that are tempting. So they said, if you know you're susceptible to buying this kind of sales item, don't go to a place when it has a sale and such. The savvy shopping or using coupons and price comparison was a very common advice. And lastly, one that I think is mostly an advice in the media because it lends itself to very nice kind of websites is the do-it-yourself. Instead of buying cucumbers, grow your own cucumbers. And these three things were kind of the top advice, although there were, of course, a lot of different strategies in these 852. These are just the most common, the most frequent ones that were mentioned, but there were a lot more. And if you look at how many of them overlapped with what we found in the academic literature, we found that about half the strategies mentioned in the media were the same strategies that also had been tested by researchers, and half were different, like the do-it-yourself has never been tested as a strategy really in the lab. Now, lastly, the third thing that we looked at for gathering our strategy sample was actually asking participants. So we collected a sample of 1,000 Canadians and Americans from this website called MTurk, which is a place where people can participate in research for very little money, maybe $1 for every 10-minute study they do. And we just asked them, we explained the idea of strategies, and then we said, what kind of strategies do you use in your own life to limit spending and increase saving? And they told us, and we coded, again, two coders coded this into the types of strategies that people mentioned. And here, the most common ones that people mentioned was budgeting, making lists. That was really more than half the pool was budgeting. And they also mentioned things like, I've talked to my spouse, every time I'm in the store and I see that iPad, I call my spouse and say, like, do we need an iPad? And they will tell me no, and then I will not buy it, So this I really loved this strategy because it really hasn't been studied at all in the literature, and a number of people mentioned it. So like having the partner as a goal reminder, or like having the partner help you following through on your goals. And a very common thing that was mentioned too was making your money inaccessible. And there were some really creative strategies, not just leaving your wallet at home before you go somewhere, but also things like, I freeze my credit card in a block of ice. And then when I want to use it, I have to wait until it melts. That was only mentioned by one person, but it was very creative, right? And it falls under this accessibility thing, like making, if you know it's tempting, you make it inaccessible. A more commonly mentioned accessibility strategy was things like, don't save your credit card information on websites like Amazon, so that it becomes a little bit more difficult to make purchases when you're tempted. So you have to go and find your credit card to enter it again, right? So placing little barriers in your life that makes the spending more difficult was kind of the theme here. All right, about 50 of these also overlapped with the academic literature, or with the strategies that had been empirically tested. And about 94% overlapped with the strategies we had found in the media sample. And this makes me have the shocking conclusion that perhaps people read media more than academic articles. And it might, and it actually, it did inspire me to perhaps translate my own articles a bit more to the media. So when I found this, or half a year later or so, I started a blog at Psychology Today, Financial Matters, if you ever want to look at it, to actually put every article that I write about spending in layperson's terms, because clearly people don't really read the academic papers, and that's totally understandable because they're pretty dry. But there is a lot of things we can do as academics, I think, to translate that more. All right. So overall, from those three approaches, we found considerable overlap. So budgeting and limiting access and just avoiding tempting situations, that was mentioned by all three. There were some discrepancies. For example, the savvy spending and coupon purchases. The literature actually shows that this increases your spending. It doesn't decrease. And if you think about it, like the reason stores put out coupons is not because they want to save you money. It's because they want to make more money, right? So there's a number of studies that really show if you give people coupons, they will spend the value of the coupon plus a little more than they would have spent otherwise. So not to say that there's probably some people who can do this so well that they actually save money, like the super couponers or something. But if you're just trying to use it without really getting into the whole world of couponing and know everything there is to know about it, then the risk is that it might backfire, these strategies, right? So we did find some discrepancies. And we also found some unique solutions, like this call your partner solution, that wasn't mentioned in the media or wasn't mentioned in the academic literature yet. All right, now I'd like to talk about, like, are some of these strategies actually more effective than others, right? Like, we have a lot of sets, like we know, the media recommends one thing and the academic literature recommends the other thing. Now, I want to show you two studies in which we actually tested these, not just in the lab in a one spending decision kind of situation, but we actually tried to educate people about these strategies and then followed them over a month to see if it actually changed their spending across the many, many spending decisions you make in a month, okay? All right. So what we did is we recruited 505 Americans and Canadians, again from MTurk, from this website. People ranged in income, they ranged between 18 and 80, so there was really, most of them were in their 30s. About half of them were female, half of them were male. So we really have a range of participants here, okay? And what we did is we first, I actually have a cool dot. No, it doesn't work. So the first, we asked them on the first of the month to fill out a survey. Then we reminded them 10 times over the month of what we told them in the first one. And at the end of on the 31st, on the very last day of the month, we again asked them to fill out a survey. And that's our dependent variable. So what did we do? In the first day of the month, we randomly assigned them to one of 4 conditions. Some people were told about 8 strategies that we had gotten from the academic literature. So we call these expert strategies, because we know they're tested. We know they worked in the lab. So those should be pretty good strategies. We assigned some people to read about 8 strategies that we got from the media and lay sample. Remember, they were almost identical, right? So we got those strategies from there. And some people we just ask, describe 8 strategies you already use personally. And the last group of people was just a control group, an empty control group. We didn't ask them to do anything. We didn't talk about strategies. We just asked them to fill out the survey. We're just following them along, right? And that's kind of our business as usual idea, right? So all the other conditions we wanted to compare to that last control group to see, like, oh, are we actually making meaningful changes by reminding them of these strategies? Then we ask, like, what is your goal? What do you want to spend this month? And the reason why we ask always a goal and then compare it to actual spending is because spending itself isn't bad per se, right? Like, it's just bad if you spend more than you want to. But if you spend just as much as you want to, then it's not a problem. That's why we're asking what the goal always. Then in those 10 surveys during the month, we reminded them of the strategies. So depending on which condition they're in, they're either reminded of those expert, the lay, their own strategies. They had to write them again. And at the end of the month, we ask, how much did you actually spend in the last month? Tell us. And that is our main question here. All right, so now we come to the data. We have our 4 conditions here: the control group, expert, media, and personal strategies. And I'm going to show you bar graphs that show how much they spent, how much they want to spend, how much they actually spent in dollars here on the left. Okay, and the gray is the goal that they set at the first time, as the first day of the month, and the white is the actual that they say at the last day of the month, how much they actually spent. All right. So for the control group, participants, not surprisingly perhaps, they spent more than they wanted to spend. So they spent about $300 more than they wanted. The expert strategy, that gap was reduced. So they're no longer significantly spending more, but the actual spending wasn't any different than the control group. So telling them about 8 strategies that are empirically tested and reminding them 10 times during the month of these 8 strategies didn't really affect their spending at all, right? The media and lay strategies, they actually wanted to spend a little more, and they also spent more than they wanted. There wasn't really a difference between goal and actual spending, but again, not a significant difference to the control group. It also, like, it's not like the media and the lay participants had a better list of strategies somehow than the academics, right? Like, reminding them of that list also didn't really have a difference. However, the personal strategies, the group that was asked to list their own things that they're already doing, that was the most effective, and it was actually a significant difference to the control group. So the people who were not given a list of strategies to use, but who were asked to write their own list of things they already do, but they were reminded 10 times of this list over and over and asked to write it down, they actually saved or spent less money, on average about $200 less, or 10% of the overall spending, than the control group that had business as usual. So this really surprised us. We're like, oh, do people have like a better list of strategies themselves than the other people? We thought, oh, well, maybe it's just that they're more engaged, you know, because they're writing. They're not just reading the list, and now they're writing. We should test that again. So we did another study in which we made the list more engaging. So here now we didn't just show them a list. We picked the 6 best strategies that we thought best in the sense of most people listed them. You know, that's how we operationalize best. So those are 6 strategies. We made a little video, 2-minute video of these strategies where we're explaining how to use these strategies. And then we're asking them to write down examples of each of those strategies so that they're engaged too. We call this the provided strategies because it's a mix between expert and media strategies. Then another group was again just describing the strategies they're already using. They didn't watch a video or anything. They just described those strategies. And we had a control group that didn't do anything. And then instead of reminding them 10 times, we only reminded them 4 times in the study, and at the end of each week, and they were reporting the spending in the past 7 days each time. And then we aggregated all those spending reports to have perhaps a better measure of how much they actually spent. Rather than one judgment, we had 31 days judgments, and we could add them all up to get at like a how much did you actually spend report. All right, so what did we find? The suspense. All right, so we have control group, provided strategies with extra involvement, and personal strategies where you write your own strategies. Again, have the spending on the left. What we found was, again, the actual spending was different in the personal strategies condition than the control group. So they spent again about $200 less, but it didn't affect the actual spending in the provided strategies. So the same thing happened. The personal, like writing down your own strategies, was much better for them than getting like this curated list of our best strategies with a video and write examples. It was still better to just write your own strategies. Why is that? And oh, I should have said, like we also went in and coded the strategies they listed because we thought, oh, maybe these are just like the really knowledgeable participants who just have this perfect strategy that will fix everybody's problem. They had the exact same strategies as we found in that first sample of 1,000 people who voted, it didn't differ at all. They were just basically the same strategies as the ones in the list overall, but they were still doing a lot better if they just came up with them themselves and if we had given them a list. And what we thought was probably going on here was that it's probably a fit between the strategies that people list themselves, because there is a range, right? There's like maybe 50 different types you can use. And the ones people list are the ones they've already tried and found to work. And they work for them personally, right? Because there might be some people who are particularly future oriented. And for them, setting goals and thinking of the future self might be a lot more effective than someone who is less future oriented. And someone who might really thrive in writing budgets, you know, like that really fits for them. So we ran a couple of studies that I'm not showing you the specific data here because they were much more boring. They were little lab studies where we're asking them to imagine hypothetical scenarios and such. But there we found throughout that if we're manipulating the fit, or if we're asking them to rate the fit between the strategy and their personality, then those strategies are the ones that are the more effective for them. So it really seems like if you're asking people to come up with their own strategies, they have a wealth of experience to draw on that outmatches anything academics can provide from the outside. Perhaps if we could have hour-long interviews with each participant and really get at who they are, we could give them a curated list and those strategies might be great, but that's not really possible, right? So trusting participants to list their own strategies, what fits best for them, was really the most effective for us. And this is not, I don't want to overclaim my novelty here. So there is actually already research out there on other interventions outside the financial domain, right? We already know that interventions that fit with the personality of the person taking the intervention, though that makes the intervention work better, right? And one way to ensure fit is of course asking the person, you know, like do the things that you already know how to do. Now, the other thing is, so that's my first message to you. You know what works for you, you know, and that is probably going to be better than if you're reading a media article or an academic article that tells you this is the great strategy to use, everybody should use it. Probably not going to work as great as what you're already doing and what you know works for you. But I also want to drive home the point that if you're these control participants would have been using the same strategies and they still spent more than the people who were part of our study in this condition, right? So it's not enough to just use some strategies from time to time, like really sitting down and writing out the strategies that you know works for you and then being reminded of that throughout the months. That's what really helps people, you know? So they were just as good and knowledgeable at using these self-control strategies, but you still need the reminder. All right. So now the other aspect that we tested is that we were interested. Remember, I told you there's a timeline. Temptation happens in the store, but there's so much that can be going on beforehand, and as you enter the store, and as you're already at the exit. So if you're thinking of it as like a time continuum of everything that happens up to you making the purchase, there is perhaps a number of things that can happen in advance and a number of things that can happen in the situation, like the setting the goals usually happen and making a budget, and all that happens before you even get into the tempting spending situation. But some strategies happen in the spending situation, like if you hold it in your hand, you're like, how much am I going to regret making this purchase? Or you look at it and you're going, how much is this going to hurt my retirement savings account? You know, so there is some things that can happen before, and we call those proactive strategies, and some that happen during the situation. We call those reactive strategies. And in this study, we wanted to know, is it better to use strategies that happen before or better to use strategies that happen in the situation? You could have arguments for both, right? Like maybe it's a lot more powerful to use them in the situation because you know, that's when you can tailor your reaction to the temptation, but it might be better to do it beforehand because sometimes then you might not even encounter the temptation. If your strategy is things like avoid tempting situations, you know, take the long way to not get near that store that I know will tempt me, then that might actually be more successful. So here we ran a study that was very similar to the first one I showed you. So they did a survey at the beginning of the month and at the last day of the month, and then 10 reminders throughout the month. And our conditions were giving them examples on strategies that they can use before, or examples, that strategies that they can use during a tempting situation. And then, because we already know the personal writing is the important part, we asked them to come up with 3 proactive strategies in one condition, and in the other condition, come up with 3 strategies that you might use as you're seeing the temptation, as you're already encountering it. All right. Oh, and we asked them at the end of the month, when did you use strategies most? Before encountering the temptation or after? And we did find that participants who were assigned to one of those 2 conditions at the beginning of the month really did report using strategies either before or after, in line with our assignment. So they did remember it. I mean, I guess we reminded them 10 times during the month, but they did at least remember the instructions and used and followed the instructions as well. All right. What did we find? We found that there was a significant difference in the direction that participants who were instructed to use the earlier strategies, so use them before you even get to the situation, those were the more effective strategies than the ones that they were using during the situation. And that might be because of things like really making the choice a lot easier on yourself and reducing the amount of effort it even takes to resist the temptation if you're setting up your situation in advance so that the temptation feels less strong. So to sum up, what are the best strategies? What have we learned? What are the best strategies? The best strategies, first of all, are the ones you're already using. So yes, it's important to know about a lot, but you probably already do use a lot of strategies in your own life, and you've probably already winnowed down the ones that work best for you. So you just have to use more of those. So rather than learning new strategies or trusting the media articles that tell you, do it yourself, grow your own cucumbers, and do all those other things, that we think are best, think of what you're doing yourself. And that's probably the ones that are more effective. We also knew, though, that the earlier you use them, the better. So if you have any strategies that you're using that are more proactive, those are probably the more effective ones. And one advice that we haven't tested directly, but that has been tested multiple times in other domains that are not financial, is that the larger your repertoire of strategies, the better chance that you're finding one that fits the specific situation. So if you have a larger repertoire of things you could be doing to set up yourself for success, then that's probably best for you. And that's part of the reason why I'm telling you about all these different strategies of freezing your credit card, so you can have a wider repertoire of things that might be useful. However, I do want to also end on 2 thoughts, is that this, I don't want to give the impression that this is a cure-all, or you can just, just use strategies and you save $200. That sounds a bit like just don't subscribe to Disney Plus, and your life is solved. There is like a fundamental problem in society where people really are often in situations where there is no disposable income that they can save, right? So there's a whole portion of the population where there's like, I can't use strategies because all my money is already accounted for by fixed expenses. Obviously, this is not going to help them, right? And I don't want to suggest that it would help. This helps people who already have disposable income and who perhaps find themselves often in situations where they regret spending, or where they feel like, oh, I would have rather spent it on this long-term goal than this short-term temptation, Those people can really benefit from using strategies, but there is a lot of things that we have to address by simply making more income available. So that it can only go so far if there are no funds and no disposable income. And the second time, I also want to mention that I don't want to leave you with the thought that spending less is always better, right? Like it's only better if that's what you want to do. And to quote my dissertation supervisor, Roger Bühler, he's like, if you go to the grocery store and you come home having spent nothing, you totally failed at this grocery store task, you know? Like, yes, you saved a lot of money, you spent zero, but you also have no groceries, right? So sometimes spending is actually good for our mental health, and sometimes spending is what we need to do, not just on the grocery level, but in general. And I don't want to say like eliminate those things, but if you are in a position where you feel like I have a goal of something I want to spend or not spend, and I could use strategies to achieve this goal, that's where this work can be helpful. And I want to end by thanking the people who were involved in this research, as well as my funding, the person funding this, Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada. And also, if you want to see the videos explaining strategies, you can do it there if you want to get a reminder of all those strategies. Right, thank you very much for your attention.